Well, to everybody, we are here to listen to the preliminary statement which will be given by the members of the jury. As you know, after 4 full days of public hearings, the panel of the judges has taken all the evidence which was collected before and then the oral and visual evidence which has been presented in order to prepare what we call the traditional tribunal a preliminary statement. You see, an overall evaluation of what has been presented and the judgment which will be later over the next few months elaborated and transformed to a formal full verdict. The words is now only to the judges as representative with Simona Fraudatario of the Permanent People Tribunal. I have simply to thanks to all who have contributed very, very effectively, both from the point of view of the content, of the logistics, of the presence here in the audience, to the, we feel, success of this session of the tribunal. For the few of you who could possibly not know specifically what is the Permanent People Tribunal, which is then written briefly in the preliminary statement, you know that the tribunal is an independent international organization which has been established to receive and to assess the request of justice and of recognition of their right by people who do not find a satisfactory response in state on official authority. We have had this experience with the Indigenous people here in Canada, which has been a very, very important and enriched experience. And I simply introduce now how the verdict will be, or the preliminary statement will be read. There will be first prayer or introduction, which is not the juridical part of the verdict, but is a substantial expression of the significance of this tribunal. And then the members of the jury will read different part of the preliminary statement. There will be later a press release where the questions will be raised, but nothing obvious will be requested now, and that listening to the verdict would be certainly simply to listen in silence. Thanks for your attention and for being here.
Wat konorado sa wagwagong. Ona sarung wage te kayanuni. Energiga te hotia toretta. Te kenicho koto. The Permanent People's Tribunal. Tengo te hunsoni te chinwarato na nagwego no hodono soni. Ne jiru no ha rauno hunsaga. Zinue in quaja tororo. Unwa wani serate. In quaderia suio zigato o denio suni hanke. In quaja tororo unwa wani serate. Tano yotsenuna. Si. Se koda tissere ne kayanera sera koa ne kayanera koa. Titino waratum seke. Tiwasung kwana tunhatse. Ne gonorun kwatsera. Kariwa konyesta. Skana. Tano gatsan stassera. Gatni stassera. Kutinunha. Ne yunki ni staha unhutsa. Toani yungwari hota ne hudanusoni. Tanugani stassera, junkiawis, ti nyunquatarotas, yorihowana tiga, nezine wataroris tinizi ayinguatsaya, segun toniot na uwa waniserateños. Uwa waniserate. Ate wehiara que zi niawa ne zi zinua ne yudari wayastakwa, no Guangwe, the Indian Residential School, Gorahne no Guati, te Zinahutia Tawa, ne Ezora Radi Radix Agun at sea, easy no Yorihu Waxte, Tiniawa ne. Jutkum, Tianum, Tunyuhumwe, ne Aze, the Hatikun Sotoche, Roderiwage. Ayawas skena goa agahage ne ronuha, Rauderiwage, Tanagunun Quatsera, Hati Hawike. Tony the Wayato, than a Hotonu Soni. Tony the Hono Tunyo. Tano Agueguna in Guarihuayeni, in Guaderihuayeni. In Guaderihuayeni ne Aguego, in Guayota. Ne Aze, the Hatikun Sutoje Rauderiwage. Ne Skana agahage, Zionzate. Togidina Yohtu, ne Unguani Gora. What Ponorado so Aguego, Tanunyawa, Cateruni, Desa, Sawanateni Negi, Ungawana. Yawako so Aguego Daskatahun Satat.
The Permanent People's Tribunal is an international opinion tribunal founded in 1979 on the basis of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Peoples in Algiers, 1976. Since its establishment, the PPT has served as an independent forum for visibility, testimony, and justice for peoples subjected to severe forms of repression and denial of their fundamental rights to self-determination, dignity, and collective existence, particularly in situations where no competent, accessible, or impartial institutional mechanisms are available. The diversity and frequency of the 56 cases examined by the PPT to date highlight the persistent gap between the demands for justice expressed by the affected peoples and the inability of the existing juridical and political order to provide adequate responses. While operating in close accordance with the principles of international law, the PPT places victims and survivors of human rights violations at the center of its proceedings, recognizing them not merely as witnesses, but as the primary subjects and protagonists of the process. For each session, the PPT appoints an international panel of judges based on recognized competence, experience, and independence. The session on Indigenous children and unmarked burials in Canada was convened at the request of the Native Women's Shelter in Montreal, with the support of several organizations and individuals driven by the urgent need for truth, visibility, and accountability regarding the abuses committed against Indigenous children, their families, and communities, and by the determination to ensure that survivors and affected peoples are finally heard and recognized. Have you done that? The panel of judges is composed of Francis Webber, that's me, United Kingdom, Valmain Toki, New Zealand, who are serving as co-chairs, together with Carlos Beristain, Spain, Carlos Castresana, Spain, Katsitsaquas, Ellen Gabriel, Canada, Shauna Howard, Canada, United States, and Andrew Wolford, Canada. The prosecution team was led by Krista Bicanu, Sarah Glickman, Brianna Rowe from Aboriginal Legal Services and Alisa Lombard from Lombard Law, who were in charge of presenting the indictment and the evidence. The programme included 4 days of public hearing held here at the Daphne Arts Center. Canada was invited to attend and present its defence to the charges, but failed to directly respond or to appear. Information regarding the session was also transmitted to the relevant international institutions, some of which have expressed interest in following the proceedings and in receiving this preliminary declaration. That was actually the PPT's introduction. So now I'll start the actual statement, the preliminary statement of the judges. And bear in mind, we've had less than 24 hours to digest all the material that we've been provided with, all the testimony, oral and written. So to digest it, to consider it, we will be doing that over the next 3 months. This is a preliminary statement based on our first impressions of what we've seen and heard. We're not here to produce another report. There have been many reports. We have been asked to respond to the indictment and judge Canada's responsibility in international law for the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity. During this past week, we have been privileged to witness and enjoy the living culture of some of Canada's Indigenous communities, the beauty and wisdom expressed through the opening ceremony of the sacred fire and the daily opening and closing ceremonies and songs, the warmth, support, hospitality, and friendship we have been offered, the courage and dignity of the survivors giving testimony, the strength and tenacity of those who have for decades fought for recognition, accountability, and reparation. For this, we express our profound appreciation and gratitude. Our mandate was to look at missing and disappeared Indigenous children and unmarked burials, and the forced and coerced sterilisation of Indigenous women through the lens of international law. Witnesses spoke of the state-sanctioned forced removal of Indigenous children from their communities and families to state and church-run Indian residential schools, sometimes without their parents' knowledge or consent, to other institutions from the schools, including reformatories, Indian hospitals, and sanatoria. Between 4,000 and 6,000 children are known to have died in or shortly after leaving, sometimes running away from, these institutions in the century and a half up until 1997, when the last institution, Kivalik Hall in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, closed. The fate or whereabouts of many children who were taken to these institutions and schools is still unknown, although some were known to have been adopted. Many witnesses, including Dr. Scott Hamilton, said that these numbers are likely to be a gross underestimate, which, without further investigation, remain provisional and incomplete. As he said, we don't know what we don't know. Of the deaths in the institution that were recorded, and we heard that many were not, available death certificates indicate that almost half were caused by tuberculosis. We heard that children were underfed and malnourished, subjected to nutritional and medical experiments and to forced labor, and lived in cold, insanitary, and overcrowded conditions, rendering them vulnerable to infection. As one survivor, Audrey Hill, said, "They didn't care. That was the thing." One particularly harrowing account was of a 4-year-old girl with tuberculosis isolated in a freezing tent on school grounds to die alone, since the staff said, "She's going to die anyway." Parents were notified of their child's death late, or sometimes not at all. A state that paid for the transfer of an estimated 150,000 children by train, boat, and plane across hundreds of kilometers to get to the schools would not pay for dead children to be sent home for burial, or for parents to come to call the children's spirits home. Survivors told us of being subjected to harsh discipline, including strapping, solitary confinement for speaking their language or helping other children. Audrey Hill described being locked in a dark closet for days alone with no food or water. Another witness explained it was authoritarian rule over children. And as we know, many thousands of children were subjected to sexual assault by clergy and staff. We heard first-hand testimony from one survivor, Leo, who said they called me Leo the liar after he disclosed the sexual abuse to a police officer. We heard about the state-sanctioned forced sterilization of Indigenous women, including a woman who was 17, was sterilized during childbirth while under restraint and in medical distress. Witnesses shared experiences of racism at the hands of medical providers who told them they were unfit to be mothers and should not have more children. These women were pressured and lied to about the irreversible nature of the procedure. As the witness, Senor Kick, stressed, motherhood is a sacred responsibility, and that they were deprived of. The tribunal has no difficulty in accepting that this pattern of composite acts constitutes genocide. In international law, genocide need not involve mass killings. It can be a slow and continual process taking place over centuries. In Canada, the genocidal acts include the forcible transfer of children from one group to another group. This is using the wording of the Genocide Convention. The imposition of measures intended to prevent births in the group, and the infliction of serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, with the intent to destroy the group as such. The genocidal intent behind the forced removal of children was explicit. Institutions such as the Indian residential schools were a concrete manifestation of Canada's colonial policies expressed in the Indian Act of elimination of indigeneity, including denial of Indigenous sovereignty and nationhood, occupation of Indigenous lands, erasure of Indigenous legal orders, languages, and cultures. The atrocities visited on the bodies and spirits of children in the schools, on young women in the hospitals, the thousands of known deaths of children in segregated hospitals, in schools, the unmarked graves, the uninvestigated ashes of babies in furnaces, or the physical manifestations of a genocidal colonialism, which above all coveted, valued, and seized Indigenous lands, territories, and resources. The evidence revealed the attempted systematic destruction of the ties that braid together Indigenous land, governance, and family. That this is genocide, recognised by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, by the Independent Special Interlocutor, and even by the Canadian Parliament. So there's no difficulty for us to accept that that composite pattern constituted genocide. There's no difficulty either in accepting that the crimes towards Indigenous peoples, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual violence, enslavement, persecution, and other inhumanes and omissions, such as failure to provide safe and healthy living conditions, systematically applied to Indigenous children, women, and families, constitute crimes against humanity, according to customary international law. All of this is known, it's been heard before, but it continues.
Findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Inquiry into Missing, Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the Special Interlocutor, the Vatican, and the unanimous resolution of Parliament have acknowledged their residential school system as a genocide. Canada bears legal, moral, and political responsibility for its acts and omissions, and form part of a systemic policy of assimilation, dispossession, and destruction directed at Indigenous peoples. Canada's responsibility towards its Indigenous peoples for genocide and crimes against humanity is not only historic, but also contemporary and continuing. The colonial praxis remains the foundation of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. This trauma and psychological harm has a collective dimension, affecting successive generations of children, families, and communities. The stigma, cultural shaming, and guilt of survivors has silenced them. The Tribunal heard from several witnesses about the profound harms caused to children, parents, and communities by forced separation and the denigration and destruction of their language and culture, how the brutality and sexual abuse by clergy and school staff taught children to disassociate, how children punished for helping other children learned to become unkind, how abused children became abusive parents, how victims of sexual abuse were fearful as parents of showing affection to their children, how disruption of identity, unmooring from culture and family, has led to an epidemic of suicide and other mental health issues. These are continuing impacts of genocide and crimes against humanity. In international law, state responsibility for violations continues until they stop and are remedied. Remediation does not just mean ceasing the genocidal acts and crimes against humanity. Cessation is just the first step. Restitution means putting the victim back to the position they were before the violation occurred, which in this case of a stolen childhood is impossible. Reparation means repairing the damage and ensuring it doesn't happen again. Reparation obligations include conducting investigations to identify and locate the remains of every dead child, protection of burial sites, identifying and locating missing children, clandestinely adopted, locating and punishing perpetrators of cruelty and sexual abuse, and medical staff forcing, coercing or deceiving Indigenous women into being sterilised, providing full information, access to archives and records to families and communities, and return of stolen lands. As shocking as the evidence of past violations is, equally shocking is Canada's indifference to the exposure of its crimes. Having established bodies like the TRC and the Office of the Special Interlocutor, it denied them powers to compel witnesses, attendance of or the production of documents, and restricted funding, preventing full investigation. These bodies' findings of genocide have led to little beyond a shrug of the shoulders. Canada has ignored most calls for action or has done just enough to be able to say we're working with Indigenous communities in progressing the actions. All the survivors, witnesses and experts stressed Canada's lack of genuine engagement, sense of urgency, or even interest in remedying the violations. Canada is failing to comply with its international legal obligations to investigate and punish crimes revealed by survivors and families who have lost children. As survivors groups try to name victims and locate burial sites, the government sits on 27 million records containing that necessary information. It makes no move to prevent the imminent destruction on grounds of confidentiality of survivors, independent assessment process, testimonies, or even to warn them of impending destruction, so they have the documents preserved at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. The victims, survivors of abuse and families of disappeared children have borne this insufferable weight of the attempted destruction of their identity, their family, their culture, their traditions, governance structures, their dignity, their existence, have been forced to bear the weight of the investigating the crimes visited on them. The lack of information and investigation causes serious harm to psychological and collective well-being, hinders grieving and healing processes, and prevents that rebuilding of the relationship with the Canadian state, where the Tribunal notes a profound sense of mistrust. The government has been an unwilling partner in the reconciliation process, providing little help beyond sporadic and capricious funding, which is wielded as a weapon of control. Investigative journalist Tanya Talaga demonstrated the massive commitment of time and expense needed to determine one victim, finding them and their burial place. Scott Hamilton, Laura Adunt described the sheer volume of work and resources required to identify and document burial sites, made more arduous without full access to government and church-held records. It is vital for families and communities to be able to call home the spirits of their dead. But both the records and the long-term sustainable funding required for this work are withheld. Canada has done little to protect known burial sites and has allowed Indigenous burial sites to be developed for private use. Meanwhile, Canada continues to destroy Indigenous lives, communities, and family structures, culture, and identity through the ongoing forced removal of children from their parents, in many cases without attempting culturally appropriate placement, and continues to condone the sterilisation of women without consent through failure to enforce criminal laws of assault. Colonial attitudes persist in the continuing encroachment of Indigenous lands for extractive industries that pollute lands, render lands uninhabitable, and cause illness, and the failure to provide adequate health care and clean water to Indigenous communities. Adding insult to injury, Indigenous land defenders are surveilled and persecuted. Survivors of sexual abuse spoke of vicious punishments for revealing their abuse, which Kimberley Murray saw as an aspect of settler amnesty and their failure to prosecute individuals. Canada's self-amnesty in negotiating to exclude cultural genocide from the 1948 cultural genocide, omissions from the convention when incorporating it into domestic law, failure to ratify the convention for protection from enforced disappearance and exclusion of apartheid and forced appearance, forcible removal of children, forcible sterilisation from domestic legislation perpetuates and encourages denialism and racism against Indigenous peoples. We heard from witnesses that Canada's withholding of resources necessary to fully investigate unmarked graves has fueled denialism and public scepticism around the deaths of children if no bodies are exhumed. Witnesses explained that many families do not want to exhume the children, but instead follow their cultural protocols and hold ceremonies.
To conclude, in the pattern of state actions and omissions, we see continuing disdain for Indigenous lives, denial of Indigenous sovereignty over their data, their land, and their bodies, and other violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. This pattern reveals clear indications of a continuing genocide. This consistent pattern of conduct implies that Canadian authorities have sustained a strategy to evade accountability under international law, putting Canada in a deliberate state of contempt before the international community by failing to comply with its international obligations and leaving Indigenous peoples dispossessed of the protections they are entitled to under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other relevant international human rights law. We make the following preliminary requests to Canada to implement the recommendations and calls to action of successive commissions and inquiries from the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples onward, respect the self-determination of Indigenous nations and their legal orders, consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and engage them on a nation-to-nation basis. Comply with international obligations to fully investigate the disappeared children and determine their whereabouts. Provide full, good faith, and sustained support to Indigenous families, communities, and nations in their efforts to address the identification and location of missing and disappeared children and unmarked graves. Recognize and address the specific impacts on women of colonial practices and legislation, such as the Indian Act, the residential schools, and the ongoing forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women. Ensure that future support for this work is informed by United Nations mandates on Indigenous peoples' rights, human rights, and enforced disappearances. Provide long-term sustainable funding for Indigenous-led investigations and commemorations. Amend domestic legislation regarding genocide and crimes against humanity to be consistent with the Rome Statute. Condemn and combat residential school denialism and hate speech. Fully implement the Canadian Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and develop Indigenous-led public education on Indigenous law and culture, Canadian colonial history, and genocide. This concludes the delivery of our preliminary statement, and we thank you for your attention.
As has been said before, we are now opening for the public discussion, which could be translated in a press conference. The preliminary statement, as has been announced before, will be immediately or as soon as possible forwarded to the authorities, not only of Canada, but also to the competent authorities at United Nations and to different groups who are organized. Or I think that here now is open for those who are possibly requesting some more qualification or clarification, and I think the jury is ready to answer. I don't know whether you have to comment something. No.
And I can confirm that we are back on the record.
While waiting for intervention, I forgot to announce that as was anticipated, the jury or the Permanent People Tribunal will work over the next few months because we are planning, or we have been requested to plan a presentation of the full verdict on September 30th of this year, which coincides with an important date also of the history of Indigenous people who are the subject of this tribunal. So on the 30th of September, we shall at that time present a final, comprehensive and articulated verdict for the same cause, which has been assessed during this session.
Hi, Lola Calder, City News. Perhaps to one of the PPT judges, we know that September 30th is when the final report is coming out. Are you expecting or hoping for a response from the Canadian government before that comes out?
We would love a response from the Canadian government at any time.
Perhaps then just a quick follow-up. You've mentioned preliminary recommendations ahead of September 30th. Would you like them to perhaps implement those recommendations, or is you going to be expanding on them on September 30th to perhaps pinpoint some other people, whether it be the police as mentioned, whether it be churches, whoever was involved?
I think that the people in this room have been waiting since 1996. That's 30 years. 30 years they've been waiting for the Canadian government to respond, for the Canadian government to begin to implement recommendations and to begin to remedy the violations that we have identified. So yes, the sooner the better, I think.
I will just add to that Indigenous peoples in Canada have been appealing since 1920, since the 20s, to the international community when Haudenosaunee Chief Desgahe traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, and asked for an audience with the League of Nations, which was a predecessor to the United Nations, and was denied the opportunity to address. And so here we are in 2026, and Indigenous peoples are still asking the international community to address the situation.
Olivier Cadet from the Eastern Door newspaper. My question would be to maybe some of the members of the prosecution. After going through this whole process, how meaningful is it to hear the judges say what you know is the truth out loud, even as a preliminary statement?
Thank you. I think what you indicated is true. Like, I'm still absorbing it, and I'm very grateful. I'm going to say, though, fairly confidently that we knew all along the evidence that we were putting to the Permanent People's Tribunal judges actually constitute the crimes that were being alleged. And I'm actually going to turn, because I may be a member of the prosecutorial team, but at the Center for the Survivors, and I want to know what Robbie thinks.
It's been a really long journey just for me, but this has been ongoing for many, many decades. So yes, this is something that it gives me hope. And it's a long, long journey, like I said, but it's a beginning. And to me, I am thankful for what you've brought today and for the judgment, and that will continue on until we get final resolution with this and we get answers. And it's only what we've ever asked for. Just tell us, tell the country the truth of how this came to be. We didn't do this as children. We were taken as children. So yeah, I want the truth, and I want all sides of the truth. Survivors have been standing up for a long, long time, trying to get people to understand and to listen to us. But now I want the church, I want the government, anyone involved, stand up and tell your truth. Tell us what your part was in this, but how are we going to change things? How are we going to move forward together? Because we all have to live together. So, yeah.
Okay. Obviously, this has been, as we've seen from people, being emotional while the statement was being read, this has been a very difficult process. Why do you believe it's important to sort of relive what happened in a way through this process? And do you hope to not have to relitigate your truth over and over again?
So there's a couple of things to be said. Telling the story is always going to hurt. They lived that reality and that truth. The bravery in sharing it is acknowledged and important. Part of telling the story and having the truth is a part of the healing journey. So no one wants to ask someone to relive the worst moments of their life over and over again. But you do want to provide a space where survivors and people that have lost loved ones have an opportunity to share their truth. Because in hearing that truth, but not just saying it, it's one thing, it's truth when it's said, it needs to be listened to as well. And it needs to be heard. Truth needs to be heard and accepted to be truth. And so it's not about wanting to retell the story over and over again, right? It's about a truth sharing process. It's about acknowledging the harms and figuring out a way to get a path forward. And the survivors, throughout the history of a number of good things that have happened in this country, like the TRC or the National Inquiry or the interlocutors' work, have had opportunities to share stories. And it is difficult and painful. But you know what? There were some people that weren't ready at certain points. And if there's people ready now, then we need to give them the space as fellow human beings. We need to provide them the space to be able to talk their truths. And we need to be able to listen and acknowledge the truths. And so it's really important in this whole process. And that's why it's important, the first question you asked me, like, why was it, like, what was the decision? And yes, I'm very appreciative of the decision. I'm very confident that we put the evidence forward that was needed. But hearing the decision today, and it shows that the judges were listening. They were listening to all the testimony before them. The type of testimony that went to them were not bald assertions. They're not what denials are claiming to be about Indian residential schools or the survivors. They were truths. They heard the truths. They made determinations. As a lawyer, I heard when they addressed it in a legal framework, a human rights legal framework, their response not only was in plain language, but also built in all of the laws and all of the sort of potential reparations and legal obligations that they believe and decided Canada owes at this preliminary stage to be followed up by their final report. Is it everything I hope it would be? Yeah, it totally is.
What we've been hearing a lot from Canada in the past was the words cultural genocide, but now today we're hearing the words genocide. What does this distinction mean for you?
Can you are you asking us, or would you like to ask the panel?
Maybe a bit of both.
Would one of the judges like to answer this question first?
Yeah, I mean, genocide is genocide. Sometimes we talk about different types or techniques of genocide, not different types, but different techniques of genocide. So cultural destruction is one technique of destroying a group. Physical destruction is one technique of destroying a group. Destruction of groups happens under colonialism, but we don't want that qualifier, colonial genocide or cultural genocide, to get in the way of understanding that this is group destruction that we're talking about.
And I would just follow up the evidence that we did put before these judges, specifically with Dr. LaFontaine, explained that it's colonial violence that has led to the genocide, but she very clearly and plainly laid out how you meet the test of genocide. And so that's what the judges would have taken into consideration in this preliminary determination. And it was the position we've taken all along. So when we use a term like cultural genocide or colonial genocide, and the controversy in Canada around this is specifically that the TRC made a finding of cultural genocide. You would have heard in the evidence in this proceeding that the use of cultural genocide was to acknowledge like the loss of languages and everything else. Using that sort of little phrase in front of a word seems to lessen the legal finding of genocide. And so when we brought the prosecution, when the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal asked us to bring this prosecution, we didn't want any riders around it. They asked us to prove or demonstrate genocide, and that's what we aim to do. And that's what the witness testimony and the survivors particularly were able to contribute to their finding.
This one is for the judges. With this being your 57th tribunal, I'm wondering if you could tell us about a case or cases where this has led to enforceable action, whether it's from the state, whether it's from private entities, but just something to highlight just how deeply influential this can be and how it can lead to further actions.
Thanks for the question. I think that is important, and we didn't have the time today to explain in fully the long story of the tribunal. As you know, the Permanent People Tribunal is not a penal tribunal, which is not imposing, say, prison or condemnation in that sense. The Permanent People Tribunal is giving names which are usually refused because, for instance, the first exercise of the tribunal is just to call those who are repressed not victims but subjects of right, which is already an important point, because one of the points which happens to people in general to be criminalized, to be when they are opposing to the states, they are the criminals instead of because they are resisting to the repression of the states. We are looking what was happening in the last few years in Gaza, but not only in Gaza, in general. The fact of calling those who are different enemies and sometimes terrorists, or those who are rebellion in that sense, is one classical, very old but very successful tool to hide the real problem, or at least to postpone the result of that. In this preliminary statement, key word which has been used to qualify that if you compare the horror for what has been happening, that on the other side you have the horror of the indifference of the state, that in front of the evidence they don't do anything. Now, for what happened to the tribunal, it would be long to tell a history of 56 previous tribunal. However, we had various experiences which have been cases which have been useful for the object or the victims. Take, for instance, the first sentence of the tribunal, just to give the idea of history of minorities, was a sentence which was requested by liberation movement and a representative of a very small people of the Sahara, the Western Sahara. They were at that time minority, old colonial victim of interest of Morocco, Spain, United States, and they didn't have any identity card to present themselves to the community as a people with an identity. They were not simply people of the desert, but they were a population. And the text of the tribunal has been used by them for many years to represent themselves for the first time to the African Union, and that was important. The same has been true for another small people who was subject to a very open genocide of a different type, post-colonial or colonial genocide, the Timor East, which was again immediately after the liberation from the Portuguese colonies. There was a repression for Indonesia supported by the United States. And then the verdict of the tribunal was the only one who requested for many years in the United Nations the presence of that and allowed them a representation in that sense. The other verdict, which could be, again, interested and used, could be a completely different one, which was when a problem for the genocide, the name of genocide. When we had a tribunal in the old time for Argentine, there was Argentine was in a dictatorship, but most of the states were declaring, and they had also the World Championship in Argentina during the dictatorship. So Argentina was in fact a normal state. When we had the tribunal, for the first time, we presented the desaparecidos, the disappeared population, which is a name which is recurring here. And we called them really a genocide because that was a kind of prohibition for the future for a very important social group in that sense. Just to show that names of crimes could be used either to deny those crimes because you can't define them, but on the other side, you could really interpret it and make manifest what is the real substance of that, and especially genocide, because the genocide as a crime should be declared with a main purpose, not to put anybody into prison, but to prevent the continuation and the reparation of the genocide. And in this sense, in the recommendations we are making to the Canada government, the core of the recommendation is really to transform the formal recognition that something wrong is going on into a reparation for a real population, which is the people with an identity to self-determination and to dignity.
So to encourage implementation of the judgment, the Permanent People's Tribunal is going to be sending the decision to the relevant United Nations bodies and mechanisms and to the Vatican, which played a central role in operating the residential schools. And we will be exploring the possibility of engaging international monitoring mechanisms to encourage Canada to respond.
Excuse me. I had not understood the question about genocide, but I can offer a response now. This is a preliminary finding. You have already been informed of that, and we will have time to reflect and to deliberate and to make final decisions on the thousands of documents and the dozens of testimonies and the expert reports we have been listening during 4 days. We have been able to deliberate only during 1 day. So it's very preliminary, but still our findings are very clear in the sense that we declare here that we have found facts amounting to genocide, basically the forcible transfer of children from one group to another group, the deliberate causing of serious bodily and mental harm to members of the community, and also forced measures of sterilization of women belonging to the group. And these 3 modalities of the 5 modalities that the Convention Against Genocide recognizes as possible conducts addressing crime of genocide, we have identified have been committed with the intent of destroying the group as such. For destroying human groups, racial, ethnic, religious, you don't need to exterminate all the members of the group. It is enough that you commit these facts with the intention to destroy the group as such. This is what the Convention provides. And we have found this intention in a continuing manner, at least beginning in the Indian Act in the 19th century, and at least continued until the 70s, where 26% of the Inuit women were forcefully sterilized. And in this 1 century process, we have identified state agents as perpetrators, and also non-state agents, part of the clergy, the staff of the residential schools, that were acting with tolerance of the state. And for this reason, state or non-state actor, the final responsibility relies on the states. Has the duty to respect, but also the duty to ensure. And when we have seen with a lot of concern in the very recent years is not only, it has already been mentioned, the many recommendations and reports that had not been implemented, but some kind of a strategy of the Canadian authorities in order not to implement the obligations coming for the state of Canada from international law, but also avoiding the ratification of the international instruments that would permit to the victims find the protection of the international human rights law. So if we are considering the lack of activity and the lack of implementation in domestic law, and the strategy to avoid to the victims access to the protection of international law, we are talking here about a complete vicious circle of impunity, both domestic and international. This is in this very preliminary statement. You will have to wait until September for more details. Thank you.
Bonsoir. Bon, je veux dire quelque chose. Je veux dire quelque chose sur
I
la
want
question de
to speak a few on terms of reparations. I'm going to speak in French.
Pour le tribunal,
For
les
our tribunal,
populations indigènes que nous avons,
we're talking about the indigenous populations that we've heard from up until now. There's been so many recommendations from the 1970s. There's been in different
la Commission de la Vérité,
the Truth and Reconciliation Convention.
hier avec les
There's been different interlocutors
personnes, les enfants disparus.
who are, and then have been working about missing children and disappeared children. But I have the experience of working with a Mayan population in Guatemala, also an indigenous group.
Et pour retourner.
And there's two directions that we need to go. It's going and then returning, right? So if you want to teach something, you also need to be able to learn something.
La population,
If you want to request something from a population, are you willing to offer something? So this is a fundamental question we have before us right now.
qu'il y a une mauvaise compliance.
We have understood or heard that there's a lack of compliance to the recommendations
Des différentes commissions.
from the different commissions that have already happened.
Quand on parle sur la question des disparus,
And we know that when we're talking to a crime of missing, but no more disappeared. This is a continual crime that goes on. It's a perpetual crime that is still existing. That this is the destiny of this person. If we could
etc.,
know the story, find the body. If we cannot do that, it's a permanent crime until there is an answer and an appropriate or sufficient answer at a victims international center. But it's
un douleur permanent parce que
it's a permanent pain and suffering because the grieving process, the ceremony process is all broken by the lack of response and the disinformation.
aussi c'est
It goes.
un dommage transgénérationnel.
In this case, is it intergenerational or transgenerational
C'est manque, c'est faute.
thing? It's more than one generation that feels this and grieves the lack of responsibility from the state and the accountability. So we have to take into consideration this transgenerational impact. And there's lots of processes and ceremonies and trying to do healing. But no, this has to be taken seriously.
Sûr qu'on peut
It's
rencontrer cette commission. Mais
It's not just one person for the commission. We want to change. There needs to be a change between the state and the indigenous community. This is
futur de
the main thing that's needed to be able to have any answers to the different subjects we have spoken to.
So
I think the bottom line is people just want to get on with their lives. They don't want all these roadblocks, all these things stopping them from just living. We, the settler communities, the colonialists, we get on with our lives. We need to learn that others have that right too. I think it comes down to that. It's very simple when it comes right down to it.
Everything has been clarified, at least. As you know, will go on. Session of the tribunal is never the end of a research or the opposite. We are starting, as has been said, with in-depth evaluation and assessment according to the terms which have been summarized here, what has been presented so far. We are starting now a new work. I do hope, I am sure that certainly the organization who have requested us and where they are here will take, first of all, some of the recommendation in order to make them something which is really part of the political and cultural debate. The term cultural is really important, not to disqualify or qualify in a way which is really making misunderstood the term of genocide, but we are really facing a culture of Canada which needs really long-term commitment. We know that the Indigenous people is working this ever, but possibly this verdict could be one tool more in this perfect request of recognition and especially implementation of fundamental rights. And we shall try to accompany over the next months in different way. Certainly, for instance, somebody has more or less suggested that Canada is not the only one. We discussed also on how to make some steps with respect also, for instance, with the church. We are coming from Italy. We could have possibly some access to that. But I think that we have to look for different allies in order to be really part of a permanent group, which is not simply a permanent tribunal, but a permanent representative of the right of Indigenous people. Thanks for your presence here. And I think that from our point of view, if nobody else would like to add, I thank for all those who are being here. And you like to...
No, I was just picking up the mic from it. We were just going to make a short statement on behalf of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal and all of the entire teams of people that actually have been working for months. So, I mean, it starts with the survivors, right? And then it also starts with teams and teams of people, frontline workers, allies, people, Indigenous people who are survivors or second-generation survivors, frontline service providers that deliver services like the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, that each and every day are protecting and taking care of Indigenous people that have suffered the consequences of the genocide and the crimes against humanity. And that the statement that we want to make, and having just heard it ourselves at the same time that you're receiving the statement, was that the preliminary finding is not only welcomed and embraced. You could look in the room and see survivors crying, smiling. It was a very emotional moment for a lot of people. It's been years of work. NACASET has been fighting to have this particular process in Canada for like 3 years now and elicited and did a bunch of work. Her staff has been working tirelessly. What you may have seen if you were on the live stream is moderators talking about ways to reground yourself or put out messages of love and kindness so that those watching who might be impacted by listening to those hard truths had opportunities to have some self-care and time for each other or themselves. In these rooms, we have had elders and firekeepers. We have had clan mothers, support workers, and people here just supporting each other and giving each other love. Witnesses, staff, everyone looking out and taking care of each other. Those human connections, those are the exact type of relationships that support one another moving forward. And on behalf of both the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal and Aboriginal Legal Services, we welcome the preliminary statement, particularly the finding of the continued genocide. We are quite appreciative that the enforced disappearance has been a finding because, I think there's been some debate around it over years. And I think the evidence that was put to these judges, and they're the only ones who can answer why they determined or on what basis, and they've already spoken to that, and we'll get more on a decision. But for survivors, and we've heard this time and time again from survivors specifically, the fact that they, in their decision, actually refer not just to missing children, but to disappeared children, that they're picking up the language that the survivors and experts are saying is important to recognize, that these children were disappeared. You'll hear other survivors say that these children were stolen. You'll hear survivors talk about their time in institutes as being like convicts, because that was their truth and lived thing. So having these words read in today will have a lot of meaning, and it will take time for us to absorb what that meaning is. But we have nothing but hope moving forward. And one of the questions to the panel was, about enforceability. It's been clear all along, this is a court of opinion, this is a court of people. But this is a tribunal that is in its 57th session and has international legitimacy and is a great space for truth-telling and truth-sharing, and has the mechanisms and connections to put into place, as one of the distinguished judges mentioned, to give it to the bodies that are important, the United Nations, other bodies, investigatory bodies that are important. When the world's watching, it raises accountability. And I mean, I'll turn it to Naka to add anything if she wants. She's a shy public speaker. But one of the things, how did she convince me to join this? I just want people to hear the truth. I just want Canada to be accountable and to acknowledge. And if they won't, then we need to force them. And we need to raise the awareness so people know. And when we share truth and when it's heard, then that's what leads to change. It takes the public listening, watching, and caring. And no one likes to hear hard stories. No one wants to talk about our, tragic and dark past, but it's a lived reality in this country. And so this is a hopeful preliminary decision for survivors, for families, for those that never had their children return. Because what's next? And we heard the Secretary General say, this is the starting point. It's a strong one. It's a strong starting point. So the statement on behalf of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal and Aboriginal Legal Services is we welcome this decision. We know that these judges heard and listened to the evidence that was before them. We also will implore other Canadians, and this is the kind of last message here in our statement, we will implore other Canadians, citizens, and human beings to be upstanders to when you hear denialism or talk about Indian residential schools being a good thing, or demands to dig up our lost children's bodies. I want you to take a stand. I want you to challenge those individuals. It's not appropriate. This is like humanity and disparity at the bottom of the barrel. when people do share these truths, to have people so disgustingly challenge the people who've gone through those harms, it's not acceptable. And we have an entire younger generation that grows up with so much more strength than my generation that are not afraid to talk back. So let's take the lesson from our children and not just be simple bystanders. Let's challenge these bad ideologies and people that are questioning the most heinous things that have now been found an act of genocide and crime against humanity, but as pointed out by the distinguished judges, has been so before. It's time to move forward. It's time to support Indigenous people that have experienced these crimes against humanity and genocide. So if nothing else, please challenge denialism. It's the least you can do. Chimigwech, Nyaweh.
Thanks for this important information. Let's close this meeting for today with a thanks to the jury, because they have been working very, very hard in order to be able to synthesize already something which could be used immediately and not over a few months. And we thank them because we have been so good in putting together so many ways of listening and translating the witnesses into something which is becoming then a common good for the Indigenous people. Thanks a lot to everybody, and let's go for it.
I'll have to. What's going on, Horado? Nyawakoa artist, the Wagwego, Nyawakoa to the judges of this permanent People's Tribunal on missing Indigenous children and unmarked graves. We began on Monday, May 25th, and have come to our final day of the PPT. From the introductory speech and opening statement to today's preliminary statement, it was truly a powerful and emotional for all in attendance and for all listening through the live stream. I really want to acknowledge Nakwset and her team from the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, Krista Bikanu, and your team from the Aboriginal Legal Services, and all the support workers that Krista has already mentioned. At this time, Nakwset requested for everyone to remain, and she has some acknowledgement she would like to do, and I'd like to call her up. And as she's making her way, I just wanted to ask first everyone to remain for her to do an acknowledgement. We'll also be doing a closing that will take place at the ceremonial fire. So as we head over, we want to invite everyone to head over to the ceremonial fire. And we're going to bring this week to a close in a good way. So this session, the closing, will be led by Gatna Sohondir, and we will make our way over to the fire following Nakwset's final acknowledgements. Nyawakoa.
Let's educate the back still listening. Thank you for that. This it's having said it's having said it happens so things on like here. Yeah. Yeah. I think it, yeah.
As we're waiting, as Nakuset is making her way, I think we will also have Gatnasaho Deer, who will be doing a few closing words here. This is because the live stream will not be, the closing at the fire will not be live streamed, but we will have some closing words for those who have been listening in all week and just to help bring the session for those listening to the live. Okay, Nakuset can continue from here. Gatnasaho, if you'd like to come up and can be on. Yeah, you can make your way around. Yawakoa.
There are so many people to thank. And I know that I thanked everyone at the beginning. So if you rewind to the beginning statement, I thank all of those people again. But and Cyrielle, apparently I didn't thank Cyrielle, but thank you, Cyrielle, from the David Suzuki Foundation, because the translation was amazing. And I really want to continue working with you. This whole process, if I did not have Krista Big Canoe, we would not be here. I asked other lawyers to help me, and everyone screamed around from the room. Nobody wanted to touch this. Krista is that person. So grateful for you. I'd like to present you and Sarah with the beautiful coat like I'm wearing from Tammy Bolva. We'd also eat big time. But I also want to thank all the Indigenous legal advisors. There's too many acronyms. And we have beautiful scarves from Tammy Bova as well. So I'm going to give them to Krista because she knows her people to give out. Mm-hmm. And the judges came all the way down. We couldn't do this without you. And we hope that you will continue fighting for us because we're tired. We can do it every day. We have to continue. But if you use your voices and your strengths and your expertise, because I remember looking at all your CVs and going, oh my God, we got some really powerful people coming down. So I have gifts for you as well to take back with you to your countries, and just incredibly grateful. And for everyone in this room, and you know who you are, thank you. I think that's all our helpers, all our survivors, all our experts, like Krista, when I told you you have to do it perfect, you did it. Thank you. I'm going to hand out these gifts. So that's it. Thank you. And Bonnie Hannah too. Thank you. I know she's not feeling well. Passed out. when we talk about her responsibility when we give our Thanksgiving. It's her responsibility to watch over the tides and the water, to ensure that we have clean water. One of the other responsibilities she has is to take care of the children. She determines when the babies are going to be born. She determines when young women become women. She determines our life cycle. And with that, she is our female grandmother who takes care of all of us. So with these gifts is a reminder of our grandmother and that she's watching over us and that the rains are here today. In our way, we call them Yoganordu, which is precious water, and the tears of the ones who have gone on before us, but also precious tears, not of sadness, but of happiness. It's finally happening. Yeah, what's going on? Yeah. Right now?
Well, I was asked while they were giving out the gift to just explain a little bit about the significance of wampum. In the tradition, we know that wampum has varied meanings. First and foremost, it's spiritual. When you look at that quahog shell, it's usually purple and white. And the reason why it's purple and white is it talks about that duality that exists in this world, the upper world and the lower world, Creator and his brother. We see it in everything, men and women, fire and water, day and night. But when we take that wampum, for us, it meant a commitment, it meant a pledge. And then it was also used to record history. So when you receive that, it is something that at one time our people believed was the highest form of something that could be offered because of its spiritual significance. We use our all receiving wampum will solidify our time together, and that will always be remembered. Great way of acknowledging the work that you have done to come here to be with us for this period of week.
Okay, sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. I wanted to say that this is an enormous honor. The experience of this whole week has been an unbelievable honor and a privilege for me, and I think for all the judges. So thank you.
If I may request the judge give the microphone when the survivors come up, I believe maybe Laura can speak on behalf of the survivors. Secretariat also wanted to gift something.
So it's a very small offering. We've put medicine bundles together for everybody for the journey home. So from the Survivor Secretariat, thank you.
Thank you.
But either created some restrictions, with this district, and then the lawyer, which makes several young people. That's my talking. Actually, in the Spanish part, it's like possible. That's how it is. You see, to hear stuff. The no, right. So we're going to find time. No, but there's one thing picture. Do you find her starting? It's not doing a prayer. Let's read.
I don't, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Anige, what the gays of God is what don't see us.
Laura, where's yours? I'm gonna wear it. Let's put it on.
You eat man, I got.
Anige igere, what the gay on you got the sudder. Then the guy at the sorod and I want when he's rather. I got the white doske gigo whisk ni when he's rage. Then the hood you got the hoose of the do to your works there. Next year I was still on net was on. The gigo ni hadi nana unsa kayo no ko adi ni tunanu. Tano katne. Mona ksia you go down hodo watrodi gigo kaswanto. I was ki tanayawne. Na jigigo antagada ne. Tiniti ochage tiniti hun tunyo tinit de toga. Za ranoa jotte tinit ni. Tanagigo the hotigo sotuja da hune. Then wadu got get fluent sego. No nagre go no wada hadit sorry. No hota do wana dokane. Yehun zaskat. Ekatina na yokto nan nupa nigora. So I just said that, yeah, it's been heavy. That what we've listened to over these last 5 days. And what happened to us, when we look at how we were supposed to coexist on this turtle island, when our ancestors made this agreement with the settlers, here's what we agreed to. We said that whenever we get together, we're going to dress at that time of the day. We're going to speak our language. And the settlers that came here to our shores, when they came into our house, it'll be understood that you are guests, that we will travel along this river of life together, and that we would never, ever try to legislate or feel that we are up here. Because our ancestors asked them, they said, we know you have access to this land, but what else do we need to know? Well, they said, we're coming with God and His Son Jesus. We said, tell us that story. And when they got done, because we were spiritual people, we said, well, we shouldn't have a problem then. We'll travel this river of life. Us in our canoe, you in your big ship with sails, guided by 3 values of peace, friendship, and respect. And if anything should ever happen that our peace of mind is getting trouble, we would sit down, we would smoke the peace pipe, and we would ask those powers that be to intervene so there would always be peace in this land. And this treaty would endure as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the water flows. And our ancestors who made this, because it was the Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the Longhouse, in the language, when we talk about this treaty, it says, it says that all the original first peoples of this land, this is for them. To always remind the settlers that we are in agreement about what our ancestors said. So the sun is still shining, the grass is still flowing, and we are all here. But you know what happened, right? This. Why? Because first of all, it's always going to come to the underlying title of land. The idea was we're going to get rid of these native people. Because when we're going to talk about ownership and who owns this land, there will be remnants. There will be descendants, but the real McCoy, they will be gone. But you know what? The real McCoys are still here. I may not look 100% like my ancestors did, but I speak my language. I know my creation story. I know my songs, our dances, our speeches, our rituals were the continuance of all life. When we take our time to do all these sacred ceremonies, songs, and dances, not only for us, but for the entire world. But yet there was this attitude that said, we're going to erase that. Well, you know what? It'll never happen. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the water flows, we will be here. Because if the time ever came that you think that you're going to get rid of us, that we would become extinct, you know what? You will not be too far behind. When we look at where we are now today, in 2026, a lot of things are happening. If you look at what we're doing to this mother of ours, because of this capitalistic society that is always just about money and profits, we are literally destroying the very thing that sustains us. And if we don't begin to rethink our relationship with our mother, we will all be gone in the not too distant future. You know, the young girl, Greta Thunberg, that's just one sign about how we do. When we are doing something that is so profound and deep and powerful, our grandfather, the Thunder Beings, just heard what's happening here. They gave a sign. They said, my children, you're on the right track. Continue to raise this because we understand that this earth, we are a part of it. It is a part of us, and there's no separation. We are all participating in this sacred dance called life. Well, Greta Thunberg says that you adults, and she said this at the World Economic Forum about 5 or 6 years ago. She said, your house is on fire. You're acting as if it's business as usual. Well, you know what? Just recently, just last week, the The World Meteorological Organization put out a report, and they've looked and they've tracked the weather. And in the last 5 years, the heat is going off the chart. That means that in the not too distant future, the plants are going to have a hard time to grow because they're going to start burning up. So now we have to ask ourselves, how are we getting out of this? The scientists said that we look at the indigenous wisdom that is left on this entire planet. We take it to heart, then we can change the trajectory that we are on. But if we maintain the status quo, well, the geologists that study the rocks, fossils, and all of that, they've looked and they said there's been times, we know that Mother Earth, there's been extinctions. This time, we're causing it. So now, when I look at where we are, all of the prophecies of this turtle island are fulfilling. And for our people that said, when Europeans got here, we were like this, they were here. We helped them. And then they did this to us. And we went to the lowest low. But now, we're in the time that I refer to as the indigenous spiritual resurrection. Because now we're reclaiming our language, our ceremonies, our songs, our dances, and everything that makes us unique in this world. And we're saying to the people that we invited into our house to coexist with us, you know what? You better start listening to us. Because all of us, and I mean all of us, myself included, we all better begin to see different, to hear different, to speak different, and let's start doing different so that those future generations can have the hope that they will still be able to inherit a happy, safe, clean, beautiful, peaceful, loving home. Now, we all know that there are lessons that we learn. When there are times when we're troubled and our mind is not in a good way and we're angry about so much stuff, those can be perceived as, I'll use the term, angels in disguise. Because then when we look at how did this happen and we ask ourselves, what is the lesson learned? Then we chalk it up to a lesson learned, and hopefully we don't repeat it again. And now we move into the future with this intent that was originally there, that we would be like this. No more of this hierarchy, no more of this paternal attitude that they think they're superior to us, but that we will truly be listened to. And what we have to say in our territories, in our lands, on our turtle island, that we invited you in to coexist with us in peace, friendship, and respect. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the water flows. And where we are now is all part of this historical moment in time where hopefully that people will open up their minds and hearts, and we will make those changes for the future and for the better, not only of us here, because this thing will have implications for the entire world, because when you look at this, it's a relationship between people, and every people in the world can benefit from this wampum belt, because it talks about how brothers and sisters are supposed to live in this world in peace and friendship, because, as I said, we're all here to have an attitude of gratitude every day, to be grateful and to be thankful, because we have to sing and dance, be happy. Because as sure as that sun rises and that sun sets, we're setting not too distant future, but that sun resurrects up again, and we're resurrecting up, and we're going to be part of that ancestor realm, and that's forever. And the only reason why we come here is to experience this, the good, sometimes the not so good, but that's all part of this lower world. When we pass on, we transcend the realm of paired opposites, and now we're just going to go into whatever it is, what we imagine about sky world or happy hunting ground, or people say heaven, doesn't matter. But we know that this isn't the end all be all. So with that, I'm going to say that to all of us that are here, that hopefully you're going to get back home, you will get back home to your loved ones, and we'll all see each other again in love, in peace, and health, and friendship. Just be grateful for this great gift called life. So this says, now we're going to go over to the fire, and I'm going to do the actual closing now, the complete part. Merci beaucoup. Thank you to all of you.